walked behind me last time, so I might.
Dressed appropriately, I hope.
Uh, uh, we don't talk. We're not going to talk about that.
Okay. All right. All right. Oh no. All right. Let's get started. You should see a consent to record. Does everybody say we're recording right now, or?
Yeah, I saw mine.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All right, welcome everybody. Let's get rid of the baby bird. We just did that, and I can close some windows down. By the way, quick note for everyone just joining us now. I just sent an email, like literally a minute before I logged into Zoom, about our first unit test. It's pretty late in the quarter already to have a unit test, but it is part of the plan for the class. And I'm really on the fence about testing because this is such a weird quarter. And so I believe that testing is beneficial because it really is a chance for us to demonstrate what we know instead of our ability to look the information up once we're asked a question. So the test, I sent a lot of information about it, but the short version is that it's an open book, open note test, but it's timed. And so that creates a little bit of incentive for you to make sure you know the breadth of the material fairly well before you enter the test. Having said that, it's not a really high stakes test. It's not massive numbers of points in the big scheme of things compared to the whole class. And it's meant to be pretty straightforward within that constraint. So it's a total of 5 essay questions, and they're meant to be 1 or 2 paragraph of length. So there shouldn't be time pressure for anybody. If anybody had an accommodation, then they get their additional time accommodation on top of that. But I really don't, I don't like time pressure tests where you feel like you don't have enough time to complete your answer satisfactorily. It's not meant to be that way. It will be a time pressure test if you have a lot of questions that you need to go and open the material and read the material the first time. And so that would not be a good way to come in. So if you're prepared, it shouldn't be a matter of feeling like you're under the gun that way. Anyway, I don't want to lecture too long about the test. If you have individual questions for me about it, I'm happy to answer them once we're done with our recorded lecture part. So bye, baby bird. We'll get rid of the baby bird, not literally, just figuratively. And one of the things I had a problem with last time was I couldn't get the chat to work while we were recording. I changed my screen settings a little bit this time, and I've got a chat window floating on top now. So I think I should receive your chat. So if anyone wants to ask a question, again, I don't know exactly what is being recorded and what's not, but I think I'll be able to see your chats, and I don't think the chat window is being recorded. But if you type a message, I should be able to get your question as we go. And let's get into it. Let's get started with our topic, and we're on Whelan chapter 7. Today I'm going to go over the slide deck here, and then the plan is for okay, so we got a couple chats. I see a testing and a how do you do, so keep those questions coming, everybody. We're going to get into chapter 7. I'm going to be a little bit rough going through this because I usually like to prepare a little bit, and I was telling a student before we started recording that today was one of those days where I was just running around with my hair on fire, and I'm not as well prepared as I usually am. Some of you might be rolling your eyes and going, wow, okay. But you never seem prepared, so what now? Anyway, we'll get through it. It's okay. This is a super relevant chapter to the challenges we're facing today with information around COVID-19. One of our readings that I've selected for this week is directly about some misinformation around COVID-19. That's a classic example of some of these problems we're talking about. And we're talking about the quality of data, what affects the quality of our data. I like this chapter because a lot of our earlier reading has been about how to deceive using data, or how to misinform using data, or sneaky tricks that people play with data. And this chapter is less about that, but it's about the mistakes that people can make that lead to misleading data, so that understanding how we create good data helps us understand how bad data are created as well. So it's more of a positive framing of the issue. And I really like that because I want to come out of this class with the feeling of, wow, there's a lot of bad things about poorly sourced or poorly recorded or poorly generated data, but there's also tools we can use to make sure our data is accurate and reliable and consistent, and we can use it to make good decisions. So moving into that idea, here we go. The reason we want good data, this is back to what I was saying about liking Wieland's chapter here, is that why is it we care about good data? What is so valuable about good data? First of all, we like to have good data because we want to have data that represents a larger group. If we wanted to know, for example, and I apologize if we've been talking about COVID too much, but it's such a prime example. If we wanted to know the actual infection rate of COVID-19 in the United States, we could test every single one of 300 plus million Americans. We could test every single one of them by sticking a swab up their nose and swabbing for the virus and then checking it. The problem is that we don't have the capacity to test 300 million Americans. We don't have 300 million tests. Even if we did have 300 million tests, the expense of making the tests and testing people, getting enough swabs out there would be prohibitive. And more than that, actually running the assay, actually running the lab analysis on those would be prohibitively expensive. It would take too much time as well. So how do we know how many people have COVID-19? Well, one of the ways would be to do what we call a random sample. And this is where Wieland points out that our data is only as good as the sample we use in terms of representativeness. So if we want to know how many people in a general population have COVID-19, we have to sample them randomly. We can't choose people who look sick, or we can't choose people who are at the bus stop, or we can't choose people who are in the hospital. We have to sample a cross section of everybody. So finding a good random sample is a real challenge. I want to unwind that just a little bit more, unspool this a little bit more, and talk about this example. And I'll get back to my, my screen here. I'm gonna pin my video so I'm always on top there. And we've got just a Costco-sized bulk pack of M&Ms. We're going to get into this more when we get into some more information about polling. That's what I bought it for, honestly. It wasn't just because I wanted more M&Ms. This is a perfect example. So if I wanted to know how many of these M&Ms were blue, let's say blue is, and apologies to those of you who have blue as your favorite color of M&M, but if I wanted to have a good understanding of how many M&Ms were blue, the only way to be absolutely sure about it would be to open up the bottle and count every single M&M, right? But the problem is that would take a lot of time. In this case, not a lot of money, because I have the M&Ms here and I have, you know, plenty of ability to count. But one of the tricks we can do is, assuming that the M&Ms are randomly mixed, I could just count the blue M&Ms on this side and then count all the other M&Ms that are showing and calculate what fraction of M&Ms were blue out of the fraction of M&Ms that were visible. Would I be perfectly exact? No, but I'd be pretty close probably. And you can see if I look at the other side that it doesn't look much different, right? So this idea of a random sample is that we don't have any reason to believe that the cross-section of M&Ms right here is any different than the cross-section of M&Ms in the middle or different than the cross-section of M&Ms in the back. In other words, it's random, and that gives us a good idea of the proportion of the M&Ms that are blue versus all others. The problem we see, though, in society when we're talking about social statistics or a measure of a social phenomenon like COVID-19, even though that's a medical issue, it's something that is spread through different groups of people differently, right? At different rates, and different people are more susceptible to infection than other people are, is the evidence we have, right? The problem with people versus M&Ms is that people are never mixed up like this. People stratify themselves into various ways. And the examples I just gave you are things like people end up in the hospital if they feel sick, or people at the bus stop are not a cross-section of the American population. Those are people who have to go to work and are poor enough that they have to take the bus, and therefore might be at higher risk of catching the virus. So we have to think carefully about, let me get my screen share back up here. Where'd we go? There it is. So we have to think carefully about how we can represent a group with a random sample. And this is what I was emphasizing with the M&Ms versus people, is that in the real world, it's very hard to get a random sample a lot of times. And the lesson to take from this is that when we see a generalization about a poll or a result, we very often run into problems, not with the statistical analysis that's done or the conclusions that are drawn from certain data. The problem is often more fundamental, which is that sometimes there was a bad sample. And if we have a bad sample, we can overdraw our conclusion and reach really inaccurate conclusions. The example we have in our reading this week from COVID-19 is a perfect example of this, where these emergency clinic doctors reached this outlandish conclusion about how many people have caught COVID-19 and how therefore relatively innocuous the virus is, based on some pretty flawed sampling methodology. We'll get into that on Thursday in more detail, but I wanted to bring it up here while we're talking about it. Last point about sampling, we want to have good data. We want to be able to generalize about a larger group of people based on a small group of people. If we have a biased sample, if we have a bad sample, there's nothing we can do about that. As a matter of fact, we want to have a larger sample size compared to a small one in general. Back to my M&Ms example. This giant container of M&Ms is going to be more representative of the population of M&Ms than a fun size package of M&Ms. So the Halloween size, little squares that have M&Ms in them, I might have 5 blues in that, I might have 3 blues in it, and that might really make a funny proportion. But when I count, I don't know how many M&Ms are in here, 1,000 at least, right? When I count all the blue M&Ms in that, I have a pretty good idea about what proportion of blue is really there. So a larger sample size is better, all things being equal, but a larger sample size doesn't counteract a poor sampling design. As a matter of fact, it makes us more sure about the wrong answer. So we have to be really careful with larger sample size and biased sampling. The other reason we care about good data is we'd like to do comparison between groups. This dovetails a little bit into our reading from Best about apples and oranges comparison, is that if we have good data, we can make fair comparison between groups. The example that Whelan brings up in this context is the difference between a treatment group and a control group. We use this kind of language in medical studies a lot, where we have a group that is getting a new treatment or a drug as part of their treatment, and then the control group is treated exactly the same except for that one thing that's different. It's easier to do that in medical science very often than it is in social science. We're going to come back to this, by the way, at the very end when we talk about experimental methods versus correlational methods in research. But the problem in social science is finding groups that are the same except for one thing. We can find groups that are different in 18 different ways very easily, but it's very hard to find groups sometimes that are different in just one dimension. And that's the challenge we face to social science. The best standard we have of good data collection with respect to treatment and control is random assignment to a treatment and random assignment to a control. So that is, for every 2 people who come into a study, we flip a coin or roll the dice, and we assign one of them to the treatment condition and one of them to the control condition. And they don't know whether they're getting a drug or getting a placebo. They don't know whether they're getting a treatment that's supposed to work or getting a treatment that's untested, right? So they're blind to it. And ideally, in medical science, what very often happens is neither do the researchers who are doing the work know whether they're giving a person a real pill or a placebo pill. They just measure the people's progress, and then if somebody's getting sick or somebody's getting better, they're like, well, I wonder if that's the medicine or not. So randomization comes back as a really important idea in this differences between groups idea. So we care about good data because we want to be able to generalize from a small sample to a population. We do that all the time. And I gave you the example of COVID-19 on this, but we do simple random sampling to try and figure out how people will vote in an election, right? We see this all the time with opinion polls about a lot of issues. So that's an important social science dimension of that as well. And then comparing groups as well, we want to figure out how people respond to another example, a more practical example of this in medicine. We do this with marketing. right? We'll give people a marketing message and we see whether they respond favorably to the marketing message or not. And there's lots of examples of marketing campaigns gone wrong where arguably they had a group of advertising executives that didn't think through the marketing campaign well enough and didn't randomly distribute the ad to see if people actually really liked the ad or thought it was going to backfire maybe. So we need to think about how we test things, medicines maybe, or maybe ad campaigns. All right. The last reason we care about good data is what Whelan says is just because. And it's not just because, it's the idea that we might need it later and we don't know, which is a little bit weird way to think about it. But it turns out that when we've collected data, just because we think that data is good to have, even though we don't know what use we're going to put to it, it turns out that social scientists in particular are really good about finding uses for the data that we've been collecting. For example, there's a lot of questions that social scientists would like to ask about important social issues, and they'd like to compare people before COVID-19 to after COVID-19. But if we didn't ask the questions before COVID-19, we can't really ask people after COVID-19 and get a very reliable result. So for example, if I wanted to know how important family was to you before and after COVID-19, you might tell me, well, it wasn't important before COVID-19, but now I really care about family. That's not as reliable as actually asking you how important family was to you in 2019 and then asking how important family was to you in 2020. Because our recall might have changed due to COVID-19, not actually due to our recall might have changed more than our attitude actually changed, is what I'm saying by that. There's two different types of data brought up here that Whelan brings up. This is a little chance for him to engage in a little education about not just data quality, but also data types, longitudinal data and cross-sectional data. So for measuring people over time, that is, if I call you up every year and I ask you about, I'm going to stick with the same example I just gave, and I ask you about, I want to make sure, sorry, I'm getting distracted here, but I lost track of that's okay. I thought I saw an alert and, oh, there I do. Okay. Oh, I had a question. I thought I saw something. So the chat here has a question. I'm going to pause this for a minute. We'll come back to longitudinal cross-sectional data just to put that place mark. Is this a sample of all M&Ms in the world or merely the container? Well, two ways of thinking about that. Excellent question. First of all, if this was the universe of M&Ms, then I would know to the last M&M how many were blue by just counting the blue ones in this container. But you're right, this is not all of the M&Ms in the world. This is just a sample of the M&Ms in the world. So this represents a sample of the universe of M&Ms. If I wanted an estimate of how many M&Ms were blue in the world, counting all the blue ones in this container would be a pretty good way to measure that, right? But the example I was giving was, let's suppose this is all the M&Ms. All the M&Ms in the world are right here, and I want to know how many are blue. To answer that question, how many are blue in this container, I could go through the lengthy process of opening the container, pouring all the M&Ms out, start counting them into cups, and do that. And it'd probably take me, I don't know, an hour? Too long, right? Or if I was feeling lazy but wanted a good estimate, I would just take a sample of a cross section. Or I could just reach in there and take out 10 M&Ms or 20 M&Ms and look at the proportion that were blue. Now, obviously, if I just took out 2 M&Ms, I wouldn't have a good idea of the proportion of M&Ms in this container that were blue. So you can talk about sampling in different ways, the same way. We could take a sample of this container to find out what proportion of this container is blue. Or we could also consider this container to be a sample of all M&Ms in the world. Now, if this sample of all M&Ms is random, then taking a sample of this sample would also be a way of thinking about all of the M&Ms in the world. And as a matter of fact, I tend to trust that. I think by taking 100 M&Ms out of this container at random, we'd have a pretty good idea about the M&Ms that came from, and we'll get in more detail later, but this is a little bit of a tease, the M&Ms that came from this particular M&M factory. There's a blog post I found that says that you can actually tell which factory they came from based on the proportion of the relative proportion of the colors. So I hope I answered that question pretty well. And Katie actually did a good job explaining that too. So thank you, Katie. That was great. All right, back to this cross-sectional versus longitudinal. And I'm going to try and figure out how to keep that chat window on top. And I don't know if I can, and it's okay. Oh, there's a cheat key for it. That's all right. The reason we care about longitudinal versus cross-sectional is that longitudinal data is super useful because we follow one individual over time, and we can track that individual's changes over time. Cross-sectional is measuring a snapshot of a group of people, maybe even a random sample over one period of time, and then doing another snapshot of a group of people at another period in time. For example, if I have test scores, 8th grade math scores for a school district, then those are cross-sectional data. They give the test every year to 8th graders, but every year it's a different group of 8th graders. If I wanted to see longitudinal data, what I do is I'd follow the students from kindergarten all the way through graduation, and I'd test them for their math scores every so often. And that would give us an idea about trajectory. It would be if their scores are increasing per individual, if their scores were staying flat per individual, if their scores were decreasing, so they were doing worse at math over time. They started out good, they did worse. That kind of information is really valuable to us because it tells us more than just saying, wow, the 8th graders in 1996 were better at math than the 8th graders in 2000. Were better than the 8th graders in 2008. We don't have as good of a picture of math scores from cross-sectional data as we do from, well, we do have a picture of it, but we can't draw conclusions like we can from longitudinal data, which is, wow, these students did poorly over time, whereas these students did well over time. Is there a difference in schools? Was there a difference in teachers? Was there a difference in family background that affected their performance? So longitudinal data is super valuable, also very hard to collect because you need to follow individuals over time, and people tend to be harder to track over time the longer your study goes. Okay, now we have this idea about good data. So we all understand that good data are important. We want it. It's valuable to us. We can answer questions with it. We don't even know what questions we're going to ask sometimes, but maybe in the future we'll ask the questions. So let's keep recording data. Now let's get into sources of bias. And there's a little dimension of overlapping on these biases, but I'm going to try and frame each one so you understand the main processes that are going on. We're going to talk about the way data sets get biased so that data sets don't actually represent what is happening, or especially data sets don't represent the larger population. So this is a way that we end up with data that tells us something different than what's really going on in the larger picture. Selection bias occurs when a sampling plan is more likely to choose one type of person over another. I'm going to go back to the M&Ms example, and I apologize if you don't like M&Ms, but hey, I have the M&Ms and I'd share them, but it's hard over Zoom, right? The M&Ms example here, imagine if I had a mix of the regular generic vanilla M&Ms, chocolate M&Ms, you know what I mean, the ordinary M&Ms, and then mixed in here, I had peanut M&Ms, so a lot bigger, right? And further, imagine that the peanut M&Ms were in Christmas colors, so red and green. So I've got the regular color palette of M&Ms in here, but then mixed in a large group of peanut M&Ms that are in the red and green colors. Now, if I was to blindfold myself and reach into this container to grab out a handful of M&Ms, which M&Ms will be overrepresented in the sample by count? Somebody want to answer in the chat? Green and red, because peanut M&Ms are larger than the smaller M&Ms. So we'll get more in green and red than we expect, and in fact than are counted, because we're counting one M&M as one M&M, doesn't matter if it's peanut or plain. So we might get one kind of M&M selected over another just by size here, a mechanical selection, right? But we can also get people selected. for example, political polling used to be done by random digit dialing. Pollsters would call up people. Great question here. When it comes to selection bias, doesn't that usually mean it is a personal bias of the selector? Ideally, when we design a data framing question, we want to get good data, we try and account for that. We try and make it so that we won't select people who agree with us. That is human nature, to try and find people who will agree with the conclusions we're hoping we're going to get, and so we have to be very careful about that. Let's talk about that let's actually talk about that right now. So when we have selection bias that's on the behalf of the researcher, we want to be very careful about that. The personal bias of the selector we have to be thinking about. So let's suppose that I want to find people who agree with me that America is the greatest country in the world. That's my personal bias. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to do a poll of people, and I'm on the street and I have my camera and my microphone, and I'm walking around with the camera and the microphone, and I say, and I'm going to find people to say, hello, don't you agree that America is the best place? Now, first of all, don't you agree is a leading question, but that's my goal, is to find people to agree with me. So I said, I'm going up to people and saying, is America the greatest country in the world, yes or no? I bet you I could find people who are more likely to say yes, and then find people who are more likely to say no based on some characteristics. So probably if I found people who looked like they were homeless on the street, that would be a poor target for people to agree that it was the greatest country in the world. I'll bet you if I found white older businessmen wearing suits on the street, they would be more likely to say yes. So I can play that game if I have a bias and find more people to respond to me, right? Or if I wanted to say more people to say no to that question, I could find people who are more likely to disagree. So we want to be really careful about that kind of bias. Having said that, it's not just the personal bias of the selector. We can have other forms of bias. Well, one example here, we have selection bias in recruitment for a survey by people more or less likely to answer the phone. Now, it used to be that the way political polls were done were by random digit dialing, because everybody lived in an area code and they had a home phone and they didn't have cell phones. So the pollster would just dial random digits based on the area code until they got enough people from that area code. And then they move on to the next, and they get a random sample that way of just people they called in the area code. But the problem is that not everybody answers their phone. As a matter of fact, people who are older are more likely to answer their phone, and people who are older tend to be more conservative. So you had to correct your sample based on non-response rates. Today, that's really hard because everyone has one of these, and no one wants to pick it up when it's a random number calling you. As a matter of fact, you're likely to just put it away. So pollsters have a lot harder work to do now to get a random representative sample than they used to, because of this phenomenon where people don't want to respond to your questions. They don't know you're asking a question. They just think you're a marketer and want you to go away. Richer or poorer people might be more or less likely to engage in a response. An example of richer people being less likely to participate in a study is if they don't feel like they need to engage in a medical trial because they have really high quality healthcare. Poorer people might be less likely to engage in a study if the study takes time and they don't have time to devote. I'll give an example of that. My family was recruited to participate in a study of kids with disabilities. My son suffers from a physical disability, and Seattle Children's Hospital was doing a study, and they said, hey, can you come to our study? It's a Saturday, and you need to get your kid here to Children's Hospital campus. And you can come in and we're going to do a workshop and ask questions and do some measurements, and it's going to be pretty much the whole morning. Then when you're done, we'll give you a gift card for $30. So from one standpoint, $30 might be a lot of money to somebody who is disadvantaged, but it's also a lot of work. Like we left the house at 9 a.m. We weren't back until 1. And I didn't do it for the gift card. I wanted to help research in this case, right? But you can imagine how somebody, first of all, who is, that's going to be people who are wealthier and have Saturdays off and want to help science, like me, are more likely, I think, to participate in that than somebody who has a really, has mobility problems, which is what they're studying. So you have to get out and about, and giving up half your day in the name of science, and woo, $30. Wow, that's not a great incentive, right? On the other hand, if you have studies where people are being asked to try potentially dangerous drugs in a drug trial, you're not going to get any rich people volunteering to take a potentially dangerous and maybe down the road life-saving drug, but unlikely to be. You're likely to have poor people participating in those trials because they might see the risk as relatively small compared to getting paid. So we can see this could cut both ways, where people are more likely to participate or less likely to participate based on their income. Another question here. So polls that rely on landlines, traditionally older people. Yes, so the question here is, what about exit polls are so important? Exit polls are important for understanding how the vote went down after the votes have been cast, but exit polls are useless for forecasting an election. So most pollsters are not in the election post-mortem after somebody has already won, understanding why business. They're in the, did that ad campaign candidate X ran work or not business. They want to know how the horse race is going before the finish line has been crossed. So exit polls are done and are valuable for understanding really complex election dynamics. There are major concerns about exit polls as well, because again, not everybody stops and talks to pollsters on the way out from the election. You can imagine what kind of things might affect that. For instance, let's suppose that you were in a voting district that you had to wait in line for 4 hours to vote, and then you finally voted and you're on the way out, and some guy's sitting there going, "Excuse me, can I ask you about how you voted and why? I only have 37 questions." You're probably not going to want to talk to the guy. Whereas if you were in a district that you had to wait 5 minutes to vote, then you're likely to get polled, or you might be more likely to stop and talk to a guy for 5 minutes about your voting and your convictions. So exit polling is challenging for different reasons than is landline or traditional polling or pre-vote polling. All right, let's move on here to selection bias. And yes, another comment, with the mail-in voting, it's very hard to do an exit poll. You can ask people, but you're basically doing a phone poll again, or an internet-based poll of, hey, did you vote? And if you voted, then who did you vote for and why, right? Yeah. And yep, thanks, Chris. He has to go. We'll see you later. All right. The other problem we have with selection bias is what we call self-selection bias or volunteer bias, which is that there's some people who like to take studies, and that's me. I'm like, ooh, and my own interest in it is that I have a background in survey design and research methods, and so I'm always curious to see what other people are doing, and so I am constantly taking surveys just because I want to see what the design was. So people like me then are out there like, oh yes, I will take your study. Oh, that's very interesting to me. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity. Whereas a lot of people are sort of like, nah, I don't want to take why should I give you my data? Why should I care, right? So we get this self-selection bias or volunteer bias, which means that people who, and the challenge there is not that somebody's volunteering, it's that the kind of people who volunteer for a study might be very different in other ways than the people who are less likely to volunteer. So the people who sign up for a drug trial might have some kind of a characteristic that's important, that's different from people who are less likely to volunteer. So we've talked about a few of those already. The examples that Whelan gives are things like, are charter schools more successful than public schools? The data from charter schools is generally very encouraging. If you're a charter schools fan, it looks like students have good performance. The schools do very well. The schools are cost effective because they're run on a charter school basis where they need to be, they're not run just as sort of a public trust sort of thing. They need to, they're run with more of a free market approach. And the challenge to this is that there's also evidence that charter schools, first of all, are subject to the volunteer bias, which is that charter schools are mostly filled with students of parents who want their kids to be not in public schools. Arguably, that's a different population than all kids in all public schools. It's going to be the parents who are motivated to have their kids be in a different school because they're not satisfied with the public schools. So as soon as you have one group of students whose parents want them to be in a different school that's not representative of the rest, we can't compare those two performances anymore, right? And it's like saying, is it the honors program that makes honors kids smarter, or is it the selection bias of parents pushing their kids into the honors program and their kids tend to be a little smarter that makes a group of smart kids that makes it look like the honors program is working? And so this is a tough question to answer. There's also some evidence that charter schools tend not to provide good services for children facing learning disabilities and physical disabilities. So if charter schools are effectively, the statistical term for this in data generation is called creaming, where you take the top off the sample, you don't take a cross section of it. It's like going into the M&Ms and picking out only your favorite color. If charter schools are effectively selecting students that require fewer resources per student, then they can, then on an individual basis, and they can devote more of the resources to all students, which public schools, of course, by law are mandated not to do. So that's one of the challenges we have to assessing charter schools versus public schools. The other example that Whelan gives is different surgeries have different outcomes with respect to prostate cancer and sexual functioning. And the least invasive surgery, not surprisingly, has the highest rate of continued full sexual functioning. The most invasive procedure has the lowest rate of continued sexual functioning. So the question then is, why don't we have everyone have the least invasive procedure? And the problem is that we give people the procedure based on the stage of their prostate cancer. We don't randomly assign prostate cancer cases to treatments. We give the least invasive treatment to people who have the lowest form of cancer or the least aggressive form of prostate cancer, and we go to the more aggressive treatments to people who have the more advanced or more aggressive stages of prostate cancer. Here's the problem then, is we can't tell whether it's the treatment that is causing low sexual function or the cancer, or maybe some bit of both, because it's not random. It's people with a more advanced stage are more likely to have the more aggressive treatment, and the people with the lower stage are more likely to have the least invasive treatment. Publication bias can also occur. Whelan brings this up in the scientific literature world, which is, it's very true. It's a big problem in science today, which is we are intrigued in science with innovative, surprising, novel results. If we prove something in science that everyone already believes or everyone knows already or has been demonstrated, then there's nothing flashy about that. So for that reason, scientists are sort of constantly looking for something that's a new development, that's first of all adding to knowledge. That's why they do it, right? But there's also an incentive to find something that is unexpected sometimes in science. In other words, if we look for something and we find nothing, then that's not seen as news compared to looking for something and finding something. So we tend to only publish studies that have positive results, that is statistically significant findings or the discovery of something novel or new. We don't really know how many studies looked for it and didn't find it. And that's a problem, because sooner or later, if I try enough trick shots, I'll make one trick shot and then say, look, it happened. That doesn't mean that the trick shot is a guaranteed thing. It means that it could have been random. I have an example of this here.
Can I get your name and your major? I'm Tristan Tucker, and my major is finance.
Can I get a thumbs up if everyone can hear this?
I'm a nursing major. Damaral Moore Lopez, accounting.
Ryan Alexander,
Okay.
anthropology.
Sheree Favro, I'm major in government and international politics. Can you tell me who this is? No. Who is this gentleman? I have no idea. I don't recognize who that is. No. Ooh, I'm not sure. I don't know who that is.
Don't know. Don't care about politics. I don't know. Joe Biden?
John McCain.
I have no idea. But I probably should, but I also don't pay attention to it a lot.
Was that a former president? Yeah. Was that Nixon, maybe?
Oh, that's I've seen that guy before. I feel bad. I'm not sure who that is.
Is that Bill Clinton?
Politician of sorts.
Dude, I feel like I know him. I don't want to guess wrong, so I'm just not going to guess.
Richard Nixon.
Oh God, I don't remember his name. No, that is not Nixon.
All right, so somebody in the chat, tell me what the point of this video is. What point are they trying to demonstrate or argue? Anyone in the chat? You can just type it if you don't want to have your voice on there. I got a funny chat there. That's good. The average student doesn't know about politics. Yes, and people don't care about politics. That's right. And so the dumbing down of America, mission accomplished. The title sort of gives it away, right? Which is this whole idea of like, wow, kids these days, college students these days. The implicit argument here is that they don't care about politics and they should, or that they don't have a sense of political history because they're looking at old presidents now, right? If we keep going, then they really try and reinforce that. I'm just going to fast forward.
In all fairness, though, like the student who was doing government that didn't know.
Oh, sorry.
In all fairness, the one student that was actually majoring in government and policy, not knowing that was a problem.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. I tend to agree with some of the sentiment because I'm a cranky old guy and I'm like, kids these days, right? And then I think back to when I was like 20 years old, 19 years old. And I'm like, how much did I really know then? And I don't know if I would have done much better than these guys. So fair point. I'm going to agree with you in principle on that. Especially the cranky old guy in me is going to agree with that, which is that if you're majoring in American government, you should know who the vice president is, for example. So let's finish up the last little bit here. I want to.
He's gonna have a lot of money.
Still Ronald Reagan. Okay.
Can you tell me the name of the Vice President of the United States? Biden. Can you tell me who is a current U.S. Senator? Any current U.S. Senator? My senator is Claire McCaskill.
Okay. So that was part of that. That was part of that argument that older people know more than the younger generation kind of thing, right? So it's a little bit of a kids these days sort of thing. I thought there was a part. Oh, you know what? I missed it. Someplace in the middle they showed Kim Kardashian, and everyone was like, Kim Kardashian, Kim Kardashian, Kim Kardashian. But here's the question I have for y'all: is how many students did they ask these questions to? Does everyone smell what I'm cooking?
Oh, yeah. Like, what was the sample?
Exactly. We don't know how many. We don't know how many students they asked to get this sample. We don't know if it's representative of all the students, or if it's the students. Now, so a bunch of things could be going in here. First of all, it could be self-selection bias, which is people who are sort of like, "Hey, do you want to be on TV?" Then the people who are like, "Yes, I want to be on TV," might not be the most representative of all of the student body, first of all, right? So there might be a selection effect going on there. But then we have this, I think an example maybe of publication bias. I don't know. I don't know if maybe they found somebody who just is like, zing, zing, zing. Yes, that's Joe Biden. What, right? They put one person in there who knew it was Joe Biden. But they didn't put 5 people in there who knew it was Joe Biden. And we don't know if that was what was happening or not. I gave you the trick shot example earlier, so you can find these things on YouTube where people make impossible shots one after the other, right? but that's editing, and we know it's editing. We just don't, we like to marvel at the shot, but we don't see the behind the scenes where somebody's taking 1,000 of those impossible shots before they sync one of them, and it makes it into the editing clip. So that's a way to think about publication bias, and a little bit different than like, well, these scientific journals kind of thing. It happens in other dimensions as well, right? People select out the positive results they want to present to you and show you those, right? The plastic surgeon never shows you the pictures of their worst jobs, right? There's a publication bias in a lot of different processes like that.
Isn't that a good example to use would be like Private Veritas, where they'll like take videos and then selectively edit those videos to like make their point.
Yeah,
only.
and I think absolutely. So anytime you see an edited video where it's somebody's apparently making a very opposite claim from what was done, if you watched the longer video, you need to be really careful about that. And I'm using this as an example of publication bias because that may be sort of a level beyond even this. I mean, you could say it's part of that, but it's like they're editing the clip so that it's the opposite of what the person actually said, right? Whereas in this case, they're finding the people who know it sort of don't get included, and the people who don't know it get included to prove their point. And so yeah, it's the same sort of, it's the same ballpark, I guess, but I think one is closer to home plate and the other one is closer to left field in terms of like the scale of the problem. But yeah, absolutely. Great example. All right. This problem was huge in biomedical testing until about a decade ago, because biopharma companies wanted to have drugs that would be approved for treating conditions that didn't have treatments. So conditions that people were desperately seeking some kind of a cure or medication for. If you could publish a research study that showed that your treatment worked on problem X, Y, or Z, then you were guaranteed for a while at least to have pretty good revenue from selling that drug on the open market. So a savvy biopharma firm that realized there was a, say, $10 million payout might spend $1 million running multiple studies, and then wait for one to accidentally have a population that got better. Because if you run enough studies, there's going to be one group that does better than average because there's random variation. And they'd publish the results from that one and say, look, it worked. And they wouldn't tell anyone about the other 9 that they ran, or 19 that they ran, that had no effect. That is now actually carefully controlled, and most of these studies, especially in medical trials, have to be what's called pre-registered. So before you do a study, you have to register it and saying, I'm doing this study testing this drug with this many people and with this treatment outcome. So then there's a record of how many studies you ran before you found a positive result, if you found one at all. In other words, it's eliminating or making it really hard to have publication bias. Recall bias, I alluded to earlier, and everyone, you don't need to answer this question, but you can, great example in the chat, which is 9 out of 10 dentists approve this toothpaste. We don't know that it's we don't know it's 90% of all dentists. We just know that they found 9 and then counted one more. 9 in 10 dentists. So everyone just follow along with me here, and you don't need to answer out loud because we probably don't want to know the answer for all of us. How many drinks did you have? Just thinking inside your head here in the last week. This is alcoholic drinks we're asking here. We're asking about a behavioral medicine sort of thing, and we care about this because drinking too much is not so good for us in the long run. How many drinks did you have in the last week? And then in an average week. And now, if we did this to a whole class, let's say we had 30 students in here, then the answer to in the last week and an average week should be half and half higher. In other words, the average number should be such that the last week's half the class was lower than average and half the class last week was higher than average, unless it was finals week or spring break or something like that. But what we'll find is that people's sense of how many drinks they have on average is lower than most people's more accurate answers to how many they had in the last week. And that's true week to week. What we're saying is that when we think of ourselves as how many drinks do I have, we tend to understate the number of drinks we have. And then when we think about it, we think about what we had last week, we're a little more honest about that. And then if we think way back in time, how many did you have in an average week last year? Then we want to probably be like, well, boy, I'm not that many. Unless we've made a major lifestyle change and we really are drinking less, we're likely to discount that even further. The lesson to be taken from here is we first of all tend to remember our better selves. We don't want to remember ourselves as somebody who smoked too much or drank too much or swore too much at parties with little kids present, or whatever the behavior we are thinking of that is socially less desirable. We tend to discount that in our minds and remember our better selves. In other words, we're unreliable narrators of our own selves, right? Like this, don't think I'm pointing the finger at you all. This is me too, right? We tend to remember, oh yeah, I used to exercise a lot. And now this week was unusual. I didn't run this week, but usually I run, right? We tend to remember our better selves. We tend to emphasize memorable events over everyday ones. And so we recall things that stick out in our memories that are unusual. We don't remember the humdrum everyday sort of things. So for example, back to drinking, we tend to remember really extreme drinking events that might have been more impactful on our health in the short term, but we tend not to remember just ordinary events. So a doctor would tell you that binge drinking is not healthy for you either, but binge drinking once or twice a quarter, like some students do, is arguably better for you than drinking 2 or 3 drinks a day and never binge drinking. And I'm not a doctor, so you can talk to your own medical professional about these sort of issues if you're concerned. But we tend to emphasize these memorable events. So if we recall stuff, we don't remember how many people have died in car wrecks in the last year, but we do remember around how many people died on September 11th, 2001, even though it was 20 years ago. And then we tend to make our past opinions congruent with current opinions. This is tough because this is where longitudinal studies are really good over time. So in one of my first videos to you all, I identified that I am left of central, identified my own bias. I wanted to acknowledge that up front. What I find is that it makes, I can't please everyone at all. Almost can't please anyone, but I wanted to just sort of like put it out there because I think acknowledging our own biases is really important to understanding other people's views instead of just pretending like we're the only people that are right, because everyone has that same view of themselves, right? So what's interesting about me is that I used to be far more conservative. I grew up in a sort of a rural-ish setting with a working class family and guns in the family and conservative parents, a conservative brother. And then I got more liberal over time. The challenge is looking back, I remember that about myself, but I don't remember when it happened or how it happened or exactly what kind of things might have catalyzed my move to be a little bit more left of where I was. So this is an interesting research question, right? To a researcher, is like what happened to Tim's life over time? That's a longitudinal study, but we don't have good data on it, and we're stuck with my memory. And my memory, as we just talked about, is a pretty unreliable narrator, right? So we have to be really careful about how we recall. Another way of putting that, I put it in my own terms of my own political inclinations changing a little over time. One of the things that people tend to think is that it's hard to find people who were Obama voters that switched to Trump, even though there's evidence that there were some, because people want to make their political opinions congruent. And so people who will actually misremember their feelings about politics in a way that is more congruent with their current feelings about politics, even if those opinions have changed, right? That's a real challenge that we have to deal with in any political era, as people's recall bias really can influence the data that we get. All right, let's move on here. I've been dragging this out a little longer than I need to, and I've been going for almost an hour now in terms of recording. I want to wrap this up. Survivorship bias is where we see the data changes over time, but it doesn't change over time for the reasons we think it is. It changes because people are dropping out of the sample. So let's suppose that the sophomore year GPA is higher than it was as a freshman year. So it's the same students. We're looking longitudinally, sophomores versus freshmen. And then the junior, when they become juniors, their GPA is higher still than it was when they were sophomores. And then by the time they're seniors, it's higher still than when they were juniors. So if you're a high school principal, you'll look at that and be like, wow, the seniors, the senior class, the class of 2000 has a GPA now, an average GPA of 3.5. And when they started as freshmen, their average GPA was a 3.0. Look at how far they've come. And the challenge here, I hope some of you have spotted it right away, is that students drop out along the way. And the students that drop out are not representative of the entire group. They are from the lower ranked students at the school. Students who were pulling 0.0s or 1.0s are more likely to drop out than students who were pulling 4.0s. So the actual performance of the students still in the school may not have changed. You're just not counting students that dropped out of your sample. And that's survivorship bias. The people who survive and persist in your longitudinal study might not represent the starting population. An example might be hospital patients who undergo major surgery and have improved function after 5 years. Well, what if some of them died? Seems pretty bleak. If you're not careful, you might come up with some bad conclusions if the risk of death after 4 years was great enough that the ones who were still living were good after 5 years. Mutual funds is another good example of survivorship bias. Mutual funds regularly outperform the market. The reason is because a mutual fund that underperforms the market will die. They'll close it down. No one will invest in it. So when you choose mutual funds, a huge number of them are doing better than the market because those are the ones that have survived, and the ones that are underperforming get wiped out. They get rolled up and canceled. Which is to say that the mutual funds today that are outperforming the market might be the ones that are canceled next year once they underperform. Yes, okay, we're almost there. One last sort. I think this is my last one. Is this the last one? Yes, that's the last one. Good. Okay, I don't want to drag this on too long because you all been really patient with me here. Healthy user bias is our last source of bias in data, which is healthy people are more likely to do a bunch of different healthy behaviors than less healthy people. So we have a really hard time figuring out if the one thing we're looking at is the thing that's making them healthy, or it's the fact that they do a whole bunch of healthy things, and it just happens to be that the one thing we're looking at is done by healthy users. The example that Whelan uses is a multivitamin. People who are concerned about their health, that are more likely to engage in exercise regularly, they're more likely to go to the doctor more often, they're more likely to, less likely to smoke or drink heavily, more likely to eat organic food, all these other things we think about. They're also more likely to take a multivitamin daily. So we look at the people who take a multivitamin versus the people who don't take a multivitamin, and people who take a multivitamin are healthier than people who don't. So how do we know, though, if the multivitamin is making them healthier, or it's all those other things I just listed that we associate with people who are healthier, like going walking more often, or going to the gym more often, or drinking less caffeine, or drinking more water, right? All the different healthy things we think about are all highly correlated with each other, so we can't tell if the multivitamin really has an effect or not. The other example we have of this is this classic story. You see this in the news all the time. The media loves to tell this story, which is that elderly people who drink about a glass of spirits, and it doesn't really matter, wine is sometimes brought up, but it turns out it's also other forms of liquor, are less likely to die from a heart attack or a stroke. Now, the problem with this is let's suppose you're at risk of a heart attack or a stroke. What do you think your doctor is going to tell you? Is your doctor going to say, go ahead and keep drinking? Or is your doctor going to say, your health is really risky, you shouldn't drink? So people who are already at risk of dying from a heart attack or a stroke are not likely to have a drink, whereas healthy users, healthy people who engage in risk preventative behaviors all the way around, are also likely to keep drinking because they're not at risk of a heart attack or a stroke, because they're healthy. So it turns out that that supposed effect of a preventative effect of a glass of alcohol or wine per day is largely illusory. As a matter of fact, the carefully done studies, including out of IHME, Dr. Makdat out of IHME has done a lot of studies about health effects of drinking, and it turns out that it's deleterious in any amount. I still drink. This is a little bit of leftover decaf, but I do drink alcohol still, and I know that it's not good for me. But it's nice to hear that that headline just to remind myself of it. All right, let's wrap it up. Which is, we need to think about all these things not as why all data are broken, but how we can get good data, how we can avoid these sources of bias. We need to think carefully about. The guy brought up earlier this challenge of avoiding selection bias by avoiding our own biases, right? So avoiding stacking the deck before we do our study, and that requires being really honest with ourselves about what result we might be looking for and how we avoid that that bias implicit in our sampling design, but also thinking about how people might self-select into our sample, think about all the different sources of biases we just talked about, so we can be more careful about understanding what our data really means and how representative it might be of the thing we're trying to measure. I hope that was not too rambling. I realize it took me a little longer to get through than I usually do, and that's because I wasn't as organized as I usually am, but we did manage to get through in a little over an hour, which it seems like it's the par for the course these days. I'm gonna go ahead and say goodbye to everybody and stop recording. If anyone wants to hang out and ask questions, I'll hang out for another 10 or 15 minutes.